It was supposed to be just another defensive flight, the kind we trained for, the kind we were told would end with glory or silence. But as I looked up at the sky above Tokyo that morning, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Silver streaks, fast, silent, like blades splitting the clouds in half. P-51 Mustangs. I had heard of them. Everyone had. But hearing was one thing. Seeing them flood the air like ghosts of steel was another. You don't understand what fear really is until your body reacts before your mind. My hands clenched the controls, but my stomach turned to ice. Around me, the other pilots in formation were still trying to hold the line, still pretending we had a chance. That honor could hold back fire. But even before the first engine exploded into flame, I knew the truth. We were no longer the hunters. We were prey. That morning, the sky changed color. It was not blue. It was not gray. It was the color of ending. The hum of the Mustang's engines didn't roar. It whispered, like death making its way to you slowly, precisely, without emotion. They were too fast, too high, too efficient. By the time our squadron saw them, half of them were already gone. No warning, no time to think, no heroism, just fire and descent. I still remember the smell, burned oil, hot metal, and something else, something I can only describe as panic in the air. The cockpit fogged from the heat of my breath. I couldn't speak. My voice cracked when I tried to report back to command. Static, my ears ringing, my heart beating so loud I thought it might rupture through my suit. No one tells you what it's like to watch men you've trained with for months vanish in midair. Not fall, not crash, just vanish. Wings folding, smoke spiraling, radios going silent one by one. These were boys, barely 20, and all of us had been told since we were children that we were the last line of defense, that we carried the soul of our nation in our hands. But how do you carry a soul when your own is breaking inside you? There was a moment I'll never forget. A single Mustang came in so low, I could see the pilot's face through his canopy. Calm, focused, no hesitation. He fired a burst and banked right before I could react. The plane beside me shattered. I saw the explosion and felt the shockwave like a punch to my chest. And then there was silence. That kind of silence that only exists after death. No one prepared us for that kind of war. The kind where you are outnumbered, not by people, but by time, by machines, by progress. The Mustangs weren't just planes. They were symbols of something bigger, of a world we were no longer part of. Our aircraft were aging, slower, less armored. They rattled under stress. Our guns overheated. We flew with honor. They flew with precision. And that difference was the gap between life and death. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to stay. But my body turned. My plane pulled away. Not because I told it to, but because somewhere deep inside me, a voice screamed that if I stayed, I would be nothing more than smoke in the wind. So I fled. And that is the part I carry with me even now. Not the battle, not the loss, but the choice to live. Because when I landed hours later, they didn't call me a survivor. They called me a coward. And maybe they were right. For decades, I didn't speak about that morning. I pretended I was just another old man with stories too faded to matter. But that morning lives inside me with a clarity sharper than any blade. Every second etched into the back of my eyes. Because war doesn't end when the guns stop. Sometimes it stays with you in the silence, in the sound of birds that remind you of propellers, in the scent of oil on your grandson's jacket, in the reflection of a silver plane in an old documentary that makes your knees tremble for reasons no one else understands. There are things we carry that uniforms cannot hide, things medals cannot erase. That day in the sky over Tokyo wasn't just a loss. It was a revelation that everything we were told could collapse in seconds, that power had changed hands, that death could come wrapped in steel and sunlight and never once look you in the eye. I speak now not because I want forgiveness. I do not expect it. I speak because silence becomes a coffin if you lie in it too long, and because there is a generation growing up believing war is glorious, clean, cinematic. It is not. It is cold. It is brutal. And sometimes It is not even fair. Enough to give you a chance to be brave. The P-51 Mustangs dominated that sky, not just with speed or firepower, but with the final truth of that war. The empire we defended had already begun to crumble. We just didn't know it yet. We were flying over ruins before the buildings ever fell. And that is a kind of sadness I would not wish on any soul. If this story moved something inside you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what you feel. And if you believe that history must be told not to glorify, but to understand, then subscribe to our channel and keep this memory alive. Before I ever sat in a cockpit, I sat on my knees in the dust, reciting imperial oaths. I was 9 the first time I heard the phrase "to die for the emperor is the highest honor." I didn't even understand death back then, but they made it sound like a gift, like something beautiful. They dressed it in silk words and prayers. They taught us that sacrifice was not the end of life, but the beginning of something purer than living. We were called the sons of the empire. We were not raised to question. We were raised to obey. At school, our textbooks described war not as destruction, but as duty. Maps did not show borders. They showed conquest. And in every classroom hung portraits of leaders who never smiled. Their eyes followed you, even when you looked away. By 12, we were training our bodies for war, running drills before sunrise, memorizing coordinates, learning how to disassemble a rifle faster than we could write our names. By 14, our handwriting was irrelevant. The only letters that mattered were the ones from the military, the ones that came sealed in red, calling us to join. They told us pilots were the chosen ones, the elite, the eyes of heaven. There was glory in the air, they said. No one spoke of falling. No one mentioned what burning alive smelled like. We believed every word, not because we were naive, but because truth was hidden behind banners and drums and rituals that made us feel like legends before we even earned a single scar. I remember the day I received my flight jacket. It was too big for me. I was 17 and weighed barely 50 kilograms. But when I looked in the mirror, I stood straighter. I saw a warrior, not a boy with shaky hands, not a son who cried when his brother never came back from China, but a weapon with wings. The training was brutal. They stripped you of everything soft. You learned not to blink under pressure, not to flinch at pain. Discipline became the only thing we were allowed to feel. If you hesitated in the air, someone died. If you missed a command, the mission failed. So you learned to switch off, to act before you felt. But fear was always there. It lived in the silence between takeoff and contact, in the glance between pilots before a mission. No one dared speak it out loud, but it hung over us like fog. I watched friends go quiet days before a sortie, saw hands tremble while tightening their gloves. Some carried photos of their mothers in their chest pockets. Others folded prayers into their boots. We all had something to protect, even if it was just the illusion of meaning. There was a pilot named Sato, calm, smiled often, never raised his voice. One night he walked out into the hangar alone, just sat beside his plane and stared at the sky. When I asked what he was looking at, he said nothing, just hoping to see something before it all ended. He didn't come back from the next mission. I often wonder what he saw in that sky. They trained us for battle, but not for grief. They celebrated the fallen, but ignored the ones who returned with ghosts in their eyes. There was no space for mourning, no space for questions, only medals and silence, and sometimes shame. Some missions were clear: attack this base, protect that convoy. But others were suicide from the start, kamikaze flights. You were told it was an honor. You were told to smile. And many did, with teeth clenched so tight it bled. The moment you were chosen, they gave you a ceremonial cup of sake, wrote your name in the book of souls. The music played, and everyone clapped. But I watched one man vomit behind the barracks after the ceremony. Another tried to cut his hand open just to be declared unfit, not out of cowardice, but because some part of them still wanted to live, wanted to go home, wanted to love, to age, to be human again. None of this made it into the newsreels. None of it made it into the letters sent home. In those, we wrote with pride, with made-up victories, with smiles drawn in ink because the truth was too dangerous to confess. The pressure to be perfect was not just military, it was cultural. Entire villages sent boys off as if offering them to the gods. If you survived a mission that others didn't, people whispered. They asked why you came back, as if living was a sin, as if breathing made you guilty. I was never chosen for a kamikaze flight, but the shadow of it was always there. Every sortie felt like it could be the last. You made peace with it before your boots touched the steps of your plane. You touched the metal and whispered a name, a prayer, a goodbye. The truth is, I didn't fly for the emperor. I flew for my mother, for the little house by the rice fields, for the girl who once gave me dried persimmons and called me brave. But the system didn't care about those reasons. It only cared that you followed orders. And we did, again and again, until obedience became identity, and fear became the only thing that reminded us we were still alive. I wonder sometimes, if they had told us the truth from the beginning, would any of us have still chosen those cockpits? Would we have still lifted off, knowing what waited above the clouds? If any part of this story made you pause or reflect, consider leaving a comment. Tell us what you feel, what you remember, or what you've learned. And if you believe that history should echo through generations, subscribe and help us keep these voices alive. We first heard them before we saw them. At first it sounded like distant thunder, a low vibration, not yet threatening, just strange. The kind of noise you feel in your chest before your ears register it. The sound didn't match anything we knew. It was smoother, almost elegant, like wind slicing through silk. We scanned the sky, but the clouds were thick that day. Then one of the younger pilots said something I'll never forget. They are not ours. The formation was tight, unnaturally perfect. Silver bodies shimmering through the haze, wings long and sharp like blades in the sun. No markings we recognized, no hesitation in their approach, just speed. And then the first one dove. The P-51 Mustang didn't scream like our planes. It whispered, as if mocking the very idea of noise. It moved so fast that by the time our gunners reacted, two of our planes were already falling. No dogfight, no warning, just precision and destruction. I had heard of the Mustangs from intercepted reports. We were told they were fast, yes, but vulnerable, not suited for long missions. That was a lie. They were fast, yes, but they were also beautiful in a terrifying way. Sleek, quiet, deadly. They flew with a confidence that we could never imitate. Not anymore. Not with what we had. Our Zeros were once the pride of the Pacific. Agile, graceful, feared. But by that day in the skies over Tokyo, they felt like paper toys. Underpowered, underarmed, outmatched. We tried to climb. We tried to engage. But the Mustangs were always one step ahead. Their dive speed tore through our formations like fire through dry leaves. One of our best pilots, Captain Junichi, tried to maneuver behind a Mustang. He disappeared in a flash of smoke and flame before he even pulled the trigger. His plane disintegrated mid-air. I saw the wing flutter like a falling leaf. The rest vanished into a ball of fire. There is something unnatural about a sky where you are not in control. As pilots, we are trained to believe that the sky belongs to us, that once airborne, we are gods. But that day, we were ants beneath giants. The air felt thinner. Our oxygen masks fogged up too fast. Our voices over the radio sounded small. I remember shouting for backup. No answer, just static, and then more silence. The Mustangs did not chase recklessly. They selected targets with intention. They would dive, fire with deadly accuracy, and vanish into the clouds before we could respond. It wasn't combat, it was extermination. One of them came so close to me that I saw the pilot's eyes. Calm, cold, focused. He didn't hate me, he didn't need to. He was there to win. He was flying a machine built for dominance. And he had no doubt he would leave the sky alive. We lost 7 planes in under 5 minutes. 7. That number still sits in my chest like a rock. Those were men I knew, ate with, laughed with, trained with, gone in moments. No parachutes, no mayday, just sparks and silence. Our base scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but it was too late. The Mustangs were already gone, like ghosts vanishing into smoke. And the worst part was, we knew they would return. We had seen their power, and we had no answer. The commanders blamed poor coordination. The newspapers blamed the weather. But we who flew that day knew the truth. It wasn't coordination. It wasn't luck. It was the future arriving faster than we could catch up. They had range. They had speed. They had weapons we could barely understand. Their 650 caliber machine guns could cut through our frames like butter. Their fuel tanks allowed them to fly deep into our skies without fear of running out. And their cockpits were armored. Ours were not. The imbalance wasn't just technical. It was psychological. Every time we saw those silver wings, something inside us tightened. We could not relax. We could not sleep. The sky was no longer ours. It had become a place of dread. The ground crews noticed it too. They stopped making jokes. They avoided eye contact. The morning before a mission felt like the morning of a funeral, and no one wanted to say it, but we all knew. The Americans weren't just winning. They were crushing our spirit, one silent silver attack at a time. And still, we flew, out of duty, out of fear, out of the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the Mustangs wouldn't come this time. But they always came, and every time they did, the sky turned darker. Sometimes I wonder what those American pilots felt. Did they know what they were doing to us? Did they see us as enemies? Or were we just names in a report, numbers on a chart, dots on a map to be erased? I cannot answer that, but I know what we felt: powerless, exposed, forgotten. Our training had taught us to fear nothing. Our instincts told us otherwise. And the Mustangs reminded us that fear was not only real, it was airborne. If this story made you feel something real, let it live a little longer. Drop your thoughts in the comments, even just one word. Tell us what moved you. And if you want more voices like this, more truths hidden beneath medals and silence, subscribe now and help keep history breathing. Some men break in the air, others break when their boots touch the ground again. For me, the breaking came quietly. It didn't scream. It didn't fall apart all at once. It whispered slowly, like frost crawling across glass. After the attack of the Mustangs, everything felt different. The base had the same fences, the same dirt under our feet, the same mechanical routines. But something invisible had shifted. Our steps grew heavier. Our eyes avoided each other more often. It was no longer about winning. It was about surviving just long enough to not remember the names of the next ones lost. They told us to keep our heads high. The officers barked orders with the same pride, as if the fire still burned in our chests. But we were only breathing smoke. I watched pilots who used to brag about victory now sit silently by their bunks, staring at their boots as if expecting them to walk away without them. There was one boy, barely 18. His name was Tomio. He had a picture of his sister sewn inside his helmet lining, said she had sewn it herself, so he could remember what kindness looked like in the sky. After one mission, he came back without saying a word. He went to the washroom and didn't come out for 3 hours. When he did, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't zip his flight suit. I helped him. He said thank you, but never flew again. Command called it psychological fatigue, a fancy phrase to hide what we all felt. It was fear, pure and raw, and it was spreading like a quiet disease. One evening, I overheard 2 senior officers arguing behind the mess hall. One wanted to report to Tokyo that morale was collapsing. The other said that speaking the truth would only give the enemy power. So, they decided to lie. Our reports said we were strong, focused, ready. But the truth was we were exhausted, angry, and deeply alone. In our culture, shame is more dangerous than bullets. Failure is not just personal. It is seen as a stain on your bloodline, your family, your ancestors. That weight sat on our shoulders, heavier than any parachute. To admit fear was to dishonor everything we had been taught. So we hid it. We smiled for the camera. We wrote cheerful letters home. We recited battle poems and chanted slogans until they sounded like empty echoes. But in our eyes, in those final moments before a mission, there was only silence. I remember the night when the officers chose 4 men for a special sortie, a deep strike over the coast, a mission they knew would not end in return. They dressed it in patriotism, they gave them new gloves, a ceremonial sash, a cup of sake. They even took photos before takeoff. But one of them, his name was Kazuo, did something none of us expected. As he climbed into his cockpit, he looked back and said, "I want to live." Just those words. I want to live. No tears, no speech, just a truth too heavy to carry any longer. He was pulled from the plane, punished, transferred. We never saw him again. After that, we spoke even less. The shame of survival was something we never prepared for. The stories always ended in heroism or death. No one told us what to do if we came back with nothing but the sound of dying engines in our heads. There was no ceremony for coming. Home, half empty. Every time I looked at my hands, I wondered if they were still mine. They no longer shook, but they felt numb, like the body had decided to protect the soul by forgetting how to feel. The worst moments came at night, when the silence was too loud, when the air smelled like oil and sweat and quiet regret. We used to talk about what we'd do after the war, open a shop, see Mount Fuji again, write a book. But those dreams began to disappear like the planes we sent out. Fewer came back, and even fewer spoke. By then, the Americans controlled the sky. Every time we heard engines above, we froze. Some would reach for their helmets instinctively, even while eating. Others just lowered their heads, like animals bracing for thunder. One day, I walked past the hangar and saw an older mechanic sitting alone. He had been with us since the early days, fixed everything with hands thick from grease and years of silence. I asked him how he was. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "We were supposed to be the storm, but now we pray for clouds to hide us." That line still lives in me, because it was true, and yet we kept flying. Not because we believed in victory anymore, but because we didn't know who we were without war. We had been molded to fit the cockpit, the uniform, the anthem. Without them, we were just ghosts in borrowed skin. I flew 3 more missions after the Mustang attack. Each time, I told myself this was the one where I would not return. Wanted to die. Not but because the thought of surviving again felt too heavy. I remember my last flight before the collapse. The sky was orange from the setting sun, but it felt colder than winter. I touched the picture of my father I kept inside my vest and whispered, "I am sorry." Not for what I had done, but for what I had become. I no longer recognized my own reflection. If this voice reached you, even across time and silence, I ask only one thing: leave a comment. Not for me, but for those who had no one left to speak for them. And if you believe these stories still matter, if they help you see the human beneath the uniform, subscribe and keep these memories from fading. The machines changed before the uniforms did. That was the first clue. We began to notice how their wings cut the sky at impossible angles, how they hovered just long enough to strike, then vanished into the clouds like they had never existed. Our commanders called them strategic advancements. We called them something else. Phantoms with engines. The P-51 Mustangs were not just faster, they were cleaner. Their design was precise, their lines were aerodynamic, their engines smoother, and their guns never missed. 6 heavy-caliber machine guns mounted on each wing, capable of tearing through our fuselages in seconds. We knew every detail of them because we were trained to fear them, not openly, but instinctively. The truth was that they were built with a kind of logic we could not match. While we were still repairing old Zeros with scavenged parts and outdated blueprints, the Americans were producing Mustangs by the thousands. Their fuel tanks were larger, their ranges were longer. They could fly over Japan, complete their mission, and return to base across the ocean. Our pilots sometimes couldn't even make it to the coast and back. We were told the Mustang was vulnerable at low speeds. That was a lie. It could turn, dive, climb, and strike before we had time to react. It was not a plane. It was a declaration, a symbol of what we could no longer be. One morning, We were ordered to defend an inland industrial site near Yokohama. The alert came in around 9 a.m. I remember the sound of boots hitting the floor, pilots running, flight crews shouting. I ran to my aircraft, tightened the straps, powered up the engine. The routine was always the same, but this time, something felt different. There was no adrenaline, just dread. We took off in formation, climbing slowly through scattered clouds. The sun was behind us, the sea to our east. And then we saw them, dozens of silver arrows piercing the sky. No erratic movement, no wasted energy. The Mustangs came in low, fast, and in perfect rows. They didn't blink, they didn't swerve, they came for the kill. I tried to climb above them, to flank one from the side, but by the time I reached altitude, 3 of our planes had already been hit. Flames and falling metal. The sky filled with smoke and panic. I fired, missed, turned too late, and nearly collided with another pilot trying to escape. On the ground, the factory never stood a chance. Their aim was surgical. They knew exactly where to hit. Boilers, fuel tanks, assembly lines. The entire complex became a burning skeleton in minutes. Black smoke rose into the sky like a warning written in fire. The mission was not defense, it was survival, and we failed. Back at the base, silence greeted us. No cheers, no reports, just the low hum of generators and the distant echo of engines. Of the 12 planes that left that morning, only 5 returned. One of the pilots sat in his cockpit for over an hour, helmet still on, eyes wide open. When they pulled him out, he collapsed. No wounds, just silence. We started noticing patterns. Patterns no one dared put into words. Every time the Mustangs appeared, someone we knew did not return. Their presence became synonymous with disappearance, and slowly, even the bravest among us began to feel it. That creeping, unspoken truth. We were losing, not just battles, not just airspace, but the very soul of our resistance. One afternoon, a group of engineers came to the base with a prototype aircraft. Sleeker, they said, faster, capable of matching the Americans. We watched the demonstration, impressive on the ground, but we all knew it would take months, maybe years, to train new pilots, repair damaged fleets, adapt tactics, and we didn't have months. We barely had days. That evening, I sat alone on the edge of the runway. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, the sky painted in gold and red like an old war painting. A mechanic walked past, wiping his hands with a rag soaked in oil and sweat. He looked at me and said softly, "Do you think we are already dead?" And no one told us, yet I had no answer, because that is exactly how it felt. The Mustangs were not just winning, they were erasing our presence in the air, erasing our confidence, erasing the belief that we were still in control of our skies. We spent years telling ourselves that we were the storm, the wind, the rising sun, but now we were shadows fleeing from silver light. And yet, every morning, we still lined up, we still flew, even as fuel ran low, even as parts broke down mid-flight, even as we began to understand, somewhere deep in our bones, that the war was no longer ours to win. The war had moved to a different altitude, and we were too slow to catch it. Sometimes the truth does not hit you like a bullet. Sometimes it lands softly, like dust, and you only notice it once it covers everything. If this reflection brought you closer to a forgotten corner of history, speak it out loud in the comments. Share one feeling, one word, or one thought. Let it live. And if you feel stories like this matter, if you believe memory has power, subscribe now and help us keep the voices of the past alive. The sky went silent long before the war officially ended. You could feel it in the way the wind moved through the trees, stillness in the airfields, in the eyes of the ground crews who stopped asking when we would return. They already knew. The war was no longer waiting in the clouds. It had buried itself in us. I remember the last day I flew. No orders, no combat, just a test run to keep the engines alive. The air was still, the sky unusually clear. As I rose above the fields, I looked down and saw nothing but empty homes and blackened smoke trails in the distance. I stayed up longer than needed. I was not watching for enemies. I was searching for something that still made sense. When I landed, no one said a word. The mechanics just looked at me with something close to pity. Not because I had flown, but because they knew I would never fly again. Then came the surrender. No gunfire, no final mission, no last act of resistance, just silence, and a voice over the radio saying it was over. And just like that, everything we had trained for, everything we had lost people for, everything we believed had given us purpose, vanished. Some cheered in secret, others cried behind closed doors, but most of us simply stood there, frozen. We were not allowed to feel relief. Relief meant you had doubted, and doubt had no place in a soldier's mind. They told us to return to our families, to rebuild, to forget. But how do you return to a life that never waited for you? How do you explain to your mother that your silence is not distance, it is damage? How do you look at your father and tell him the medals feel heavier than the guilt? Many of us never found the words, so we stopped trying. I moved to a smaller town, changed my name, became a mechanic, fixing bicycles and tractors instead of aircraft. It was easier to be invisible in grease and noise. No one asked questions. No one looked at me with recognition. That was a gift, but the ghosts never left. Some nights, I still hear the hum of the Mustang engines in my sleep. Not loud, not terrifying, just steady, clean, perfect. And then, with my hands clenched as if I am still holding the controls, as if I never left the cockpit, I met others like me, former pilots who now worked in silence. One ran a small bookstore. Another was a school janitor. None of us ever talked about it openly, but there was a look we gave each other, a recognition, not of what we had done, but of what we could no longer be. One day, a young boy came into my shop. He was about 12, full of energy. Asked me if I had ever seen a real plane up close. I nodded. He asked what it felt like to fly. I wanted to tell him everything, the fear, the cold, the quiet moments before impact, but I only said it felt like being part of the wind. He smiled and ran off, pretending to shoot down invisible enemies with his wooden toy plane. I watched him go and realized something. He was playing a war I had spent years trying to forget, and somehow I did not stop him, because part of me knew that memory cannot be erased. Only of the men repainted, never recovered. I heard of a former ace who locked himself in a mountain cabin and never came down again. Another walked into the sea one evening and never returned. Their names were not written in books. Their stories ended not with glory, but with fading footsteps in the sand. There was a time I kept every photograph from those days, stacked in a box beneath my bed. Faces of friends now gone, smiles drawn thin by fatigue, planes in the background that never flew again. One day, burned them, not out of hate, but because carrying them felt like carrying pieces of wreckage on my back. But I kept one, a picture of my squadron, taken weeks before the first Mustang strike. We were all standing straight, proud, full of a confidence we no longer recognized. I look at that photo now and wonder who those boys were, what they thought they were becoming, what I thought I was becoming. I was not a hero. I was not a traitor. I was a survivor. And sometimes that was the hardest thing to explain. Time moved on. The city rebuilt. Children laughed again. The factories began to hum. And in the noise of reconstruction, we were forgotten. Not with cruelty, just with silence. People needed hope. We reminded them of loss. But I still remember. And if you are hearing these words, it means something survived. Not the war, not the ideology, but the voice, the memory, the warning. Let your comment be a way to echo that memory. Leave a thought, a feeling. Someone just know a word. This moment mattered. And if you believe in honoring the unseen wounds of history, subscribe and keep these quiet truths from being buried again. It took many years before I could speak about what happened next. Not because the memories were gone, but because they were too alive. They followed me in the reflection of store windows, in the sound of distant engines, in the way the sky looked at dusk. And then one day, long after the uniforms had been burned and the medals hidden, I received a letter. It was written in careful English, translated on the back by a student from the local school. The sender was an American historian, He had found my name in an old military archive, buried next to mission records and casualty lists. He wanted to know what I remembered of the first Mustang incursions over Tokyo. He wanted to know how it felt. At first, I ignored it. Then I read it again and again. Something about seeing my own name written by someone from the other side disturbed me. And strangely, it also relieved me, as if a door I had locked from the inside had finally been acknowledged from the outside. So I wrote back. I told him about the sound, about the silver wings, about Captain Junichi and Tomio and Kazuo, about the machine that spoke in whispers and left only fire behind. I told him things I had never said aloud, not to my wife, not to my children, not to the mirror. Weeks later, he came to see me. He was older than I expected, walked with a slow, careful step. His father, he explained, had flown a P-51 Mustang in the Pacific. He had never spoken much about it, only once saying that sometimes the hardest enemy was not the one in front of you, but the memory that followed you home. We sat together in my small workshop, surrounded by rusted tools and the faint smell of oil. Two men on opposite sides of a war that had ended long ago. And yet, the silence between us felt familiar, like shared ground. He asked if I blamed his father. I paused. For a long time, I thought of the young pilot I saw through the Mustang canopy, his focused eyes, the precision of his hand, the absence of hatred. He was not a monster. He was a young man doing what he was commanded to do, just like me. So I said no, and when I said it, something inside me loosened for the first time in decades. He reached into his bag and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a group of American pilots standing in front of a line of P-51s. One of them had his arm around another's shoulders, smiling wide, unaware of the weight history would place on that moment. His father was in that photo. He asked me if this face looked familiar, if perhaps he was the man who had once flown past my cockpit in a blur of silver. I looked closely. The jaw, the eyes, the tilt of the head. I could not be certain. The war had blurred so many faces into one, but something about that gaze stirred an old memory. Perhaps it was him. Perhaps it was another. In a sky full of ghosts, faces are difficult to separate, but something deeper was happening. By remembering together, by speaking where others had been silent, we were rewriting the story not as enemies, but as witnesses. He recorded my testimony with a small device, not for glory, not for spectacle, but for truth, for the future students who would one day read about that war, not in dramatic headlines, but in human voices that trembled as they spoke. After he left, I felt lighter, not forgiven, not cleared, but seen. I began visiting a small memorial near the coast. No grand monuments, just a quiet stone and a list of names from both sides. I would sit there in the late afternoon and watch the sky as planes from the new airport passed high above. Modern, peaceful, carrying families instead of bombs. One afternoon, a young woman walked up beside me. She was holding a book written by the very historian who had visited me. Inside was a chapter with my words. Anonymous, but still mine. She said she had read about the Battle of the Skies over Tokyo and could never imagine what it felt like to be there. Then she looked at me and said, "You were there, weren't you?" I nodded. She didn't ask more. She just sat beside me in silence. And in that moment, I understood that the end of a war is not a date on a calendar. It is a story that travels through time, carried by the living. If these moments stirred something inside you, do not let it pass unnoticed. Share in the comments what you felt as you listened. Your words may one day help someone else understand more deeply. And if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, take a second to subscribe and stay with us as more forgotten stories rise again into the light. Years have passed, and still I find myself staring at the sky like it holds answers I never received. Not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a man who once believed the sky could be owned, that it could belong to flags, or empires, or gods. I know better now. The sky belongs to no one. It only carries our echoes. There is a kind of peace that comes with time, not because the pain fades, it doesn't, but because you learn to carry it differently. You learn to let it shape you without consuming you. The war taught me many things, but its most brutal lesson was simple. Survival is not always the prize. Sometimes it is the question. What will you do with the life you were allowed to keep? I chose silence. For many years, I thought it was the only way to honor the IB, but I was wrong. Silence protects shame. Stories protect truth. And it is only through truth that we can begin to understand what war truly is. Not the pageantry, not the medals, but the price. The friends I lost, they are still with me. Every single one. I remember their laughter, the way they adjusted their gloves before flight, the jokes we told to keep the fear away. And when I walk through the streets now, with age in my spine and tremors in my hands, I carry them with me, not as ghosts, but as reminders. Reminders that every generation is given a choice to repeat the mistakes of the past, or to remember deeply enough that the past does not return disguised as pride. I once believed that bravery meant never showing weakness, that courage meant following orders no matter the cost. But the bravest thing I ever did was speak the truth, even when it hurt, even when it exposed me, even when I was not sure anyone would listen. But you did. You listened. You gave your time to hear the voice of someone the world had nearly forgotten. And in doing so, you proved something that I never expected to feel again. Hope. Hope that stories still matter. Hope that even in a world filled with noise, there is still space for quiet voices. Hope that my generation's pain might serve as a warning, not a weapon. I do not ask for sympathy. I do not need forgiveness. What I offer is a reflection, a chance for you to feel what we felt, to question what we were told, and to promise that when the sky begins to darken again, you will not look away. Because silence, we have learned, does not stop anything. It only delays the truth. To the younger ones watching this, know this. The sky is no longer a battlefield, but it is still a mirror. And what you send into it, words, intentions, ideas, will come back to you. So choose wisely. Choose peace over pride. Choose memory over myth. Choose to listen to the stories that shake you, because the ones that shake you that change you are the... And to those who walked a path like mine, in any war, in any language, know this: you are not forgotten. You were never forgotten. Even if your name was not written, even if your story was never told, you were there, and someone, somewhere, will remember. Thank you for walking with me through these memories. Thank you for listening without judgment. And thank you for carrying this story forward. If this journey touched you in any way, let your voice join ours. Leave a comment below. Tell us how you felt, what you remembered, or even just a single word. Sometimes that is enough. And if you believe stories like this deserve to live on, subscribe to this channel and help keep history breathing. The next video will appear on your screen shortly. Click it, keep walking, and never forget what the sky tried to teach us. Thank you.